Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today is December the 5th in 2023, and I have two guests today. Max Borders has been on the show before, author of many books and major thinker. Some of his books include The Decentralist, The Social Singularity, and After Collapse. Max, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And Michel Bauwens is here for the first time. He's also a thinker and writer, the founder of the P2P Foundation, and author of the book, The Political Economy of Peer Production. Michel, welcome to the show.
Pleased to meet you. I know Max, from having some fiery exchanges.
Oh, okay. I want to hear more about those later.
Never hostile, actually, but, we have some different philosophies, so that should be fun.
But also commonalities.
and-
Like I'm reading both of you,
Yeah.
and I always struck by, right, this is similar, and there are the other things that are different.
When you take two radicals, eventually they merge at some point.
It's the famous horseshoe.
But great, that's what I wanted to have you on, because I've been following both of your work closely. Big ideas, big changes in the governance of world civilizations. And I know you also track or are overlapping with areas of my work, right? So Max has been visiting me in Prospera for a conference, and Michel, you've been at Zuzalu, and we just missed each other there, by the way. Right. So, but I heard about the track that you've been working on with coordinations. I had Primavera de Filippi on the show as well. So, very excited to have this discussion today, hear more about your work, and have some fun.
Right.
First, Michel, I would like to start with you. Can you give listeners a bit of an introduction to your work and also how your ideas evolved and what you're thinking most right now? So feel free to make this a bit of a longer introduction.
All right. So, well, this is probably not so interesting, but I'm from Belgium. I have 4 children. I'm 65, and I live in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand. So it's like objective information, I guess. Then in 2005, I created the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, which was meant as an observatory of all things peer-to-peer and the commons. So with peer-to-peer, I mean this capacity that we now have for translocal organizing using digital means. So in other words, we can scale small group dynamics at the global scale, and that's just new. That didn't exist before. And the commons is that the best way to do this is actually to create shared knowledge, and so that's historically called commons. And so I'm particularly interested in the connection between peering, as it were, and reestablishing the commons as a human institution, because it's always been a very important institution that has historically counterbalanced the markets and the states. So 5,000 years ago, we moved from kinship-based social organization to markets and states. So this my interest for the commons is because it's a very important countervailing institution. So market and states are really extractive institutions. They exist to grow, to conquer, to make one particular nation stronger, and they're in competition with others. And the commons is the protective institution. It's what local people historically used to do, to reserve for the long term access to vital resources. And capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, I call it capitalism, is really the only system in the history that has done everything it could to suppress the commons. Except now, paradoxically, the digital sphere is very influenced by capital ownership, and so paradoxically, we now have a form of capitalism that is actually kind of coexisting and using the commons again. But that's just an aside to complicate things. So I have a concern to restore the commons in order to get a more balanced view. And so my work, so now I come back to the description of my work. has been, first of all, to observe the new practices that are enabled by peer-to-peer and see how they impact like really every domain. So I have a wiki with 25,000 articles that has accumulated 1 billion views. So it sounds like it's useful. And then I try to make a synthesis, like where's this going? And in order to do that, I also had two periods in my life where I spent 2 or 3 years really focusing on civilizational history. Like in the first time 20 years ago, I was looking at transitions and came up with the idea of seed forms, so that the revolutions that we are used to see as like part of human history, like the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, if they occur, they really occur at the end of a long process. And the process itself of transformation is seed forms, is people leaving the old system because it no longer works and experimenting with the new, and through that experimentation inventing a new logic. So that's kind of my interest for seed forms. And then with COVID, I undertook a new phase, and I've basically been reading Spengler, Toynbee, Sorokin. I don't know if you're familiar with those names, but these are all people who looked at the whole of human history in order to make sense of it. And so my particular spiel, if you like, is to put the commons in that global history. And then, okay, I can explain more later, but this is like the what motivates me.
Yeah, I would definitely like to hear more about this transition that you had during COVID. But before you do that, I'd like to also know a bit more precisely what is the commons and how we track them, because I have a background in economics, so I'm very familiar with the terms, also with like the technical definition and what public goods are. What I always had a bit of an issue with, or what's not mentally not solved for me, is where are the boundaries, right? So take language. Right. Language is a commons, right?
Well, okay, yeah, this is a very important thing you say, because I can nibble on that. So there is a very broad definition, which I think is not very useful, and then there's a very precise definition that comes from Elinor Ostrom. And the broad definition is what you just say. It's like everything that's common. But the Ostrom definition is everything that's common and that is governed by a community. So, and this makes it something very specific, which is it's a shared resource maintained or protected or created by a community or a group of stakeholders. That's the second thing. And the third thing, and managed following its own rules. And so that makes the commons very specific, because you have to look at a specific resource. Then, people are involved. So it's not the air, unless the air is managed somehow. But the air, or, so that makes it the fact that the human community is involved in managing, protecting, creating it. And then the third one is it's different from the state and the market, because the rules are decided upon by that community itself. So this is for me a much more specific. So when you say public goods, for example, which is the language which is used in the Ethereum community, they go back to Sam Wilson, and then he describes public goods as goods that are non-rival and non-excludable, right? This is a kind of a good. And then he assumes that it's the public. So like a nondescript, and then often actually the government. But the commoners, that's not what they're doing. They're saying, actually, it's a governance model, and we can apply it to other things as well. Like we can decide that cars are a commons simply by mutualizing the use of cars in a group of people, right? So this detaches it from the kind of objective idea that there's a certain kind of goods that are commons. No, the commons in the more specific sense is a human decision to govern a resource in a non-state and non-market way. But that doesn't mean that the commons cannot be surrounded and interacting with markets. So can I give you an example just to make it very clear? So historically, the fishermen of Senegal, that part of Africa, they made deals with each other where these families could go on Monday, these families could could go on Tuesday. There's only so much you can fish, and not on holidays and all of that, right? So they make common rules for this resource. So that makes it a commons. But once they fish it, they sell it on the market, right? So to have a commons doesn't mean that there's no market attached to it, next to it, on top of it. It's simply a specific contextual thing that can coexist with states and markets.
Yeah, that definitely solves it for me. And I would also like you to talk a bit about your intellectual development during COVID that you said that was a point where
All
you
right.
developed new
Well, that's
ideas.
a bit of a painful, a painful discussion actually, because so when I created the P2P Foundation, it took a while to get going, but it really grew into something. We had maybe 20 or 30 people working very closely together. We used kind of like a sociocratic, method, and I was traveling 5 to 7 months a year. Like I gave 100 lectures per year since 2013, which I don't recommend because it's not good for your health. But just to give you an indication. And then in 2018, I was canceled. And I don't want to play the victim, but that was a very profound traumatic experience for me because you try to be a good person, you basically give your life for a cause. You don't get rich. On the contrary, you actually lose money as an activist most of the time. And then with his identity politics, suddenly, okay, I was the evil white man, old white man, so I have -3 on the progressive stack. And I was called a Nazi, and just because I didn't agree with this kind of intersectional way of looking at the world, right? So that kind of created a like a bit of a trauma, uh, and also, but in the end, it was very good for me because I had been a lefty all my life, and then suddenly I was seeing, well, that's not what I signed up for, and where are all the people defending me? And there were very few. Like people were either intimidated, um, or just like, we don't want to get involved. So I lost all my funding. I got on blacklists here and there, and then came COVID, which didn't help, right? In terms of like getting your back on track. Uh, but so intellectually, I have a very strange combination of things. So I used to be a Marxist when I was young, but then I thought this is not working. So, and if we can't make a revolution on the outside, and we want to be happy, the only solution is to make a revolution on the inside, because this is the world as it exists. So then I got interested in psychotherapy. I became a Reichian. I don't know if you're familiar with Wilhelm Reich, the sexual revolution. I lived in 3 different communes. And then I got interested in spirituality. So I was with Osho and Dafri John, and I made many mistakes in my life. And I got very interested in integral theory. So if you're familiar with Ken Wilber,
Yeah.
right? And I still find him very interesting. But at the time in my 30s, I was like almost infatuated with these ideas. Um, and then I did a 3-year pause, which I read Western philosophy. And that was really interesting to me because I was also like reactive to Western society. And then I said, okay, well, as every civilization, is based on domination and all kind of things, but it's also the only civilization which abolished slavery, the only one. Like, there's no other civilization that has abolished slavery. So, I got like a more balanced view on civilization, and particularly Western civilization. And then I said, I was in my 30s. Okay, now I've done enough. I got this whole toolbox of psychological techniques. So now I have to do something. And so I went into startups. I had 2 startups in the 90s. I made a movie, Technocalypse, which is a 3-hour documentary about transhumanism. And you have to think about, this is the mid 90s. This is not today, right? This was quite anticipatory. Um, and my last job was working as a strategist for a big telco. And that brings me to 2000, 2004. But so I want to say I have a very varied, like, you know, intellectual sourcing, right? Because it has Marxism, it has integral theory. I studied Eastern religions, I studied Western philosophy, and that makes me hard to put in a particular box.
Well, I think that's
I
the
guess,
hallmark of intellectual honesty, to be able to pick from different strains of thought
yeah,
and sort of thinking independently, even when the whole world or just a particular strain of thoughts that you thinks that wants you to go in a certain direction, you can resist that. So
yeah,
definitely very appreciative and very just your work is very kaleidoscopic. So I really enjoy also
yeah,
your
yeah.
Substack. So you're
What I forgot to say, Nicholas, is that by the good side of being expelled from a particular tribe is that that I was compelled to look at what the other tribes were saying. So actually, started following right wing podcast channels and YouTube channels, and I was also very anti-libertarian. And I'm not exactly libertarian today, but I have a much better understanding of how people think because I actually listen to them. And when you're in a tribe, you don't listen. You have you don't read Hayek. You read a Marxist critique of Hayek, right? You don't go to all the sources. You're reading everything that's already filtered from a particular point of view. And so in some ways it's interesting to be like out there, where am I? Because then you have this moment in your life where you actually like are motivated to see, well, okay, if that doesn't work, maybe I should be looking somewhere else, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree, and also see many similarities in how my intellectual development, but that's not the topic of today's conversation. But I've also been in many different tribes and had many of these sort of transformations where you're like, oh, you were thinking these thinkers are like bad, and then you read them and actually listened, and there's actually really profound things, and then you learn and then you evolve. But Max, let's go to you because you're also a very prolific and very kaleidoscopic thinker. Do you also want to give listeners a bit of an intellectual biography and talk a bit about some of the ideas that you're thinking about most right now?
Well, first I want to say that that it was such a shame to see what happened to Michel because I was on the sidelines a bit and I was very happy to defend him because I was never in the tribe. If you like, using the Wilberian language, the Mean Greens came after him in force, and that must have been unfortunate for him having gone through that Wilberian set of stage theory ideas. That kaleidoscopic thinking that Michel represents makes him something of an antagonistic mentor to me. So while we mix it up online, it's always with the deepest respect. Like the man is brilliant, and I learn from him even in the antagonism. So we share ideas, we and that can be antagonistic, but it can also be complementary. So being, as you guys put it, a kaleidoscopic thinker is really a dispositional aspect too. It is about an openness, a willing to integrate and synthesize, a willing to discard ideas that are no longer useful and embrace other ideas that are. And I think that's why in this conversation we'll find a lot of overlaps. So, in terms of my intellectual trajectory, 16 years old, my creative writing teacher did something that changed my life forever. And it's kind of a cliche story for a young American in this time period, but handed me a copy of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, which for the adolescent testosterone addled mind is a kind of intellectual crack. But I also think of it as somewhat adolescent too, and of course at this stage. But it set me down the road to have a much more libertarian sensibility. And I've always appreciated the power, the efficacy, and indeed the experimental aspect of entrepreneurial markets. And so that really led me later in life to um, ways in which I could upgrade my liberalism, I guess you could say, because broadly speaking, I still consider myself a liberal. And the reason I do is because liberalism is asymmetrical nearly with respect to all other doctrines, if you want to call it a doctrine. It's to me, it's at least at this stage in my intellectual development, almost like a meta doctrine. And I hate the word meta; that's been so abused, but here we are. Liberalism allows for this real world experimentation. So it's not just the sort of the lofty intellectual onanism that you sometimes get out of any tribe. It is also an invitation to practice, and that's what I find very appealing in entrepreneurial markets. If you apply the lens of the entrepreneur, whether it be to commons management new ways of managing the commons as a governance model, which I absolutely appreciate. Ostrom and I are Lynn Ostrom, Eleanor Ostrom, her husband Vincent Ostrom, and I share very deep, coarse sympathies to this form of liberalism. And yet she is, in many respects, a kind of patron saint of the idea of evolved commons. But it is in that evolutionary idea, and I'm very much influenced by the complexity theorists, people like Stuart Kauffman, people like and even popular works like that of James Gleick in Chaos, his book Chaos, which is about chaos theory, and the interaction between the sort of this notion of ordered chaos and the kind of experimentation that is able to happen at the if you sort of get the protocol level dialed in. And I believe that protocol level is some form of liberalism. Now, what exactly that needs to be, I cannot say, because you can have arguments between, just as you can have arguments between Ethereum developers and Bitcoin developers and Cardano developers. You can also have arguments between people who want to espouse different forms of liberalism. And what I say is all of these intellectual arguments about the one true way are silly, and we need to apply our subversive innovation, okay, which is a term that I bring to the table. I at least I think I have, as a mode or manner of experimentation. And market entrepreneurship, in some fundamental sense, not fundamentalist sense, but in some fundamental sense, enables that. Because at some level, someone who is going to implement, say, a localized commons management system or a digitized, wider effort in commons management, these kinds of experimentations are still, in some fundamental sense, entrepreneurial. They are tests, and they will either be adopted or not. Now, Michel and I might have merely verbal disagreements about what it means to be a market, what capitalism actually is. I think there are so many. The term capitalism is so fraught, not only because, if I understand it, it was coined by Marx or Marxists, but also because it carries with it the baggage of cronyism, state capitalism. There are just so many subtypes, and he and I would probably agree to a very high degree about those problematic types. The unholy alliance between business and government, for example, that is, sorry to use the F word on your show, Nicholas, but fascism. So I am very sympathetic to some of those kinds of critiques that Michel brings, and my anti-authoritarian bent is a thread that I have continued and unwavering since the time of Ayn Rand as a teenager. I'm still an anti-authoritarian in the sense that I am fundamentally about ways that we can experiment to serve each other better as human beings. If that takes a more narrowly defined market process, let's try it. If that takes a narrowly defined commons management process, let's try it. But let's not shove some one true way down each other's throats. And that's the anti-authoritarianism in me, and I suspect to some degree it is also for Michel.
Thanks so much, Max. So both of you, very independent thinkers, many commonalities, especially sort of the anti-authoritarian bent. Michel, I would love you to explicate a bit more, right? Because many listeners of this podcast are also a bit more on the libertarian side, right? So I want you to guide us a bit through the kind of arguments, right? So I think one place where many listeners agree with you is that governments are extractive. But when you say that markets are extractive, many of my listeners are probably a bit like, what's happening here? Because the kind of perception is more, and I tend to agree with that, is that markets are positive sum, that are productive, right? So do you want to take us a bit on into your thinking, how you would react to these kinds of arguments and how you'd like to kind of change or the perspective a bit?
Right. Well, so so basically, if you look at it a bit historically, so before 5,000 years ago, humans were hunter gathering. They lived in clans and tribes. There were very light variations, in terms of class and caste. It was, um, not very huge in terms of differences. And gifting and commoning were the primary modes of exchange. So commoning means, to put something in a pool. So the hunter or the gatherer, when they come back with something, they don't sell it. It's for their family. And then there's rules like the older persons get it first, or the women get it first, or the women with children get it first. So there are rules that define how the commons is distributed. And in gifting, is like I give you something, and that paradoxically creates a need for you to give me back, because I've actually created inequality through my gifting. So traditional societies had these big festivals like the potlatch, where people would compete in giving, to neutralize each other's gifts. But 5,000 years ago, we actually go in a class-based society where some people are tied to the land, and then you have a managerial elite. And I think it's very important to see that how markets and states are connected to each other. You can't have markets without a state, because you need protection to have a market. If you don't have protection, people will take what you have. So the market and the state are like they co-evolved over time. And in the sense they're extractive is because they are at the service of a particular community, nation, empire. And so, it's Darwinian. So you're in competition with others. And so in order to win, you need more resources than the other side. And so this is just very empiric. If you look at history, societies die, empires die, and it's cyclic. And it always happens through the exaggerated use of resources. Now, there's another way in which markets are extractive, in which you're competing around your own interests, and so individually there is no incentive to take care of the whole, right? But then the state only takes care of a certain whole, and I think this is a very good description of the problem we are in today. So where the commons comes in, and I have a theory about this, which I call the pulsation of the commons, is that in the ascending cycles of societies and empires, where market and state can take good care of the core population that they serve, the commons will tend to weaken because you don't need them. You get bread from the Roman state, bread and circuses that was provided for free. But in a descending cycle, when markets and states are not providing as well and are providing less and less, that creates an incentive to recreate the commons. And this is a very observable in the history, right? So here we reach today a stage where this is my story, of course, where I believe that whatever you want to call this system that started to exist in the 16th century, it has avoided those collapses through serial exhaustions. And in the core, and we were so strong in the core countries that we didn't feel it. That when something was exhausted in Poland, we go to Hungary. When something is exhausted in Zaire, we go to Nigeria, right? And so, because of that kind of hiding away of these limits, we reach a stage where we have a global overshoot. And so, my argument is then that in the descending cycle of the current system, whatever you want to call it, which is like a market state collusion, I would agree with Max on that completely. Then there is a real necessity to restore the commons as a protective mechanism, which is no longer just local as it used to be, but needs to be cosmic as well. So I talk about cosmolocalism as this kind of necessity whereby I believe we have to go through a relocalization of production. So this is where distributed manufacturing comes in. We now have a technology that would allow us to have very productive local production. We don't need centralization necessarily. There's a lot of things we can do. Think about Arrival, not a movie, but a company where they reduce 750 processes to make a car to 50. They have a platform and they can make vans and truckers on demand. No need for mass marketing, no need for overconsumption. Use biodegradable materials and circular economy, and you can just start making vans and trucks locally based on local need. But the knowledge, we have a real incentive to mutualize the knowledge, because if you have a network, any innovation anywhere in the network becomes available for the whole network. So whatever it is that you're doing, like permaculture or anything, even but also advanced technical project, there is incentive uh, to commonify the knowledge, and it can be totally open or it can be relatively open. This is something that needs to be discussed. I'm actually for copy fair rather than copy left or copy right, which is basically protecting networks. So you have like semi-open networks to avoid big companies sucking everything out and then out competing you based on the common knowledge. So I think we are in this period of transition, because if you look at the nation state, it has no legal obligation to care for the whole. It hasn't. And this is maybe to anticipate already an important argument. I think the crypto movement is paradoxically creating the necessary infrastructures to do that. And I would go even farther and provoke you a little bit, Max. I think that proprietarian libertarians are carrying out the program of Karl Marx. Because, okay, forget about Russia. That was Lenin and Stalin. But think about what Marx said. He said, after capitalism, we have socialism. What is socialism? It's based on reciprocity and fairness. Okay? But to the degree that society becomes more independent and more able to organize itself, so he called it functional equivalence, the state will wither away. And I think this is what is happening. So we now have the crypto communities using open source, being community oriented, funding public goods, which are really commons goods, but they call them public goods because of Samuel Wilson, but they're public goods. And they're creating increasingly functional equivalence. For example, funding a public good. That is a functional equivalence. There's no taxation. It's done by the network itself. And so here is my historical scheme on the short term: 19th century, market dominated, market centric. And it worked into a certain degree. The workers' wages went up by 5. We created modern infrastructures throughout the world, but it ended because of its contradictions with World War One and World War Two. And the response of humanity was to say, we need the state. We need to regulate this market, right? And so after 45, we built the welfare state and the bureaucratic state, and we created this massive bureaucratic apparatus. And that is not working anymore either, right? So I think now is the time of networks. Um, but I don't think the state and the market will disappear. I think the question is to find a new equilibrium. But I believe the commons need to be central to the degree that we need to protect, ecological balances and scarcifying resources, because if we don't do it, we go to war. So I think rather to go to war, it would be better to find common agreements about how we are going to use the resources so that we don't have to fight each other to obtain them. So kind of that's like the broad story, that I believe this is where we are, and this is why I appreciate libertarian crypto networks, because they're creating this mutual coordination infrastructure, right? So think about this. Until, I don't know, 2 decades ago, we only had private accounting. This means you can only see what is happening to you. Your profit goes up, your capital goes up or down, and that's your world. There's no impact, right? Now we have global systems, global ledgers, and this means that everybody in that ledger can see what is happening in the totality. So we can see impact. So if we can introduce like ecological knowledge, thermodynamic accounting in these networks, then we have what I call context-based sustainability. So maximizing freedom and minimizing coercion. If we don't do it, we get eco-fascism.
Yeah, I
So,
think Michel, that's I had this discussion with Primavera as well, where I was you in the position, right? And I made the point to Primavera, hey, what you're advocating for is proprietarianism, right? That is what's enabling many of your ideas of like mutualizing many common pool resources, or like the idea of entanglement, that you get equity in each other's businesses. I mean, aren't we both advocating the same thing here right now, right? So
Yeah,
I
as
think
long as it's distributed, right? I think that the issue is if it's too concentrated, that's not good. Because right now the world is managed by 4 capital funds, right? BlackRock is the biggest. I think it's like 9 trillion. The second, Vanguard, actually owns BlackRock, and that's 13 families, right? So we are basically running the world by 13 families,
Mhm.
and I don't think that's very proprietarian. I mean, it's property
Yeah,
for some. So
yeah,
maybe where we can find each other is the idea that a lot more people should have property, right?
yeah. And
And if
maybe
we have
Max, you
more
can jump
distributed property,
into
we can
and
have more balance in the system.
yeah, and maybe Max, you can jump in and make that argument on my behalf. But I was thinking is, and Michelle, you agreed with us as well, right? There is this like state embeddedness in capitalism. That's a critique that both Max and I share. And we kind of don't like that. And we think that's the reason for these centralizations of like corporations, right? Where we
yeah, I
would
thought that
like
was
it
a
different as well. And also, what I would conjecture is if you have less of the state extraction, less of the kind of regulation, you have less of these centralizing powers. And sort of through like competition, you have a stronger anti-monopolistic force than what you have with state regulation as an alternative, right? So, and I think you end up with in a sort of more proprietarian market system, you naturally end up with more decentralization, which is kind of delivering on sort of many different visions that both of us share, right? So we don't want these large corporations, right? And maybe Max, you can explicate that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the idea that the market doesn't function without the state, I think, is a false assumption and perhaps even a failure of imagination. It is one that has dogged even the liberals throughout, the emergence of liberalism. The idea that the state or this monopoly on violence
the idea of a monopoly on certain things, but everything else is competitive and everything else is provided as a market service to improve people's lives in order to to benefit both parties is I think has plagued both that liberal interpretation as well as these conceptions of capitalism by sort of Marxist or old left leaning critics. So in that sense, I don't at all agree with Michel's understanding of history, and I would have a completely different read on history. But what I would rather do, instead of trying to go back through all of these claims he made about the way history progresses in this sort of meta narrative sense, is just to sort of come back to some very basic things. Going back first of all to Ostrom. Ostrom was responding in a great sense to the problem of the tragedy of the commons, which in very many ways, private property, particularly land-based private property, solved. Okay, similar things. There are air sheds and ocean fish stocks and things that are not as easily, where it's not as easy to assign property rights in this kind of way. And this is why, Ostrom became interested in how local commons management systems evolved. But the subtitle of her very famous book, it has the word evolution in it. And I think we have to keep that in mind. I think what I see sometimes in people like, in the sort of Michel's universe of critics, both of so-called capitalism and the way they view the world, is it tends to be this kind of abstract Rousseauvianism that is that sort of not only imagines that there will be all of this this kind of unanimity about what path to take, but that implementation doesn't require experimentation. Now, Michel himself may disagree about this, but we have to go back to remembering that Ostrom was a heavy critic of bureaucratic management of commons. The Eastern Bloc countries during the Soviet Union were some of the worst environmental offenders in this regard. And you can, for example, you can look at countries that manage their commons bureaucratically or not at all, and you can see the perverse incentives of overconsumption. Whereas, at least with property, you have an incentive to conserve. So, for example, there's no shortage of cows or chickens in the United States, but where elephants or black rhinos were either managed by distant bureaucracies, or by no one, you have this race to exploit this. And as the price of a black rhino horn goes up, and because the scarcity of black rhinos went up, or the number of black rhinos went down, and that race to exploit is really a sense the tragedy of the commons. So Ostrom was looking at these local solutions, these local communitarian solutions that addressed these issues while respecting the fact of scarcity. I agree with Michel on non-scarce goods, like ideas, that these government monopolies on non-scarce goods, on ideas, can be deeply, deeply problematic, and they can set up these corporate monopolies on certain ideas that allow them to grow and basically exclude competition. There are some sticky issues with the idea of copyrights and patents, but suffice it to say, I generally agree with him that these can and should be open sourced, and the future of crypto and internetworking is a really good opportunity to experiment with this. I also think that to appeal to Michel's Wilberian thinking, that this stuff should be a yes and, not an either or. I do think that the either or happened because most of the 19th and 20th century was basically private property versus bureaucratic management, or some disgusting, corporatist or fascist combination thereof that allowed the unholy alliances between state actors, power players, and the wealthy to collude. And in that coital bed, we get a lot of bad things that would bring about such extraction. Imperialism and capitalism um, are linked, but there's nothing endemic to entrepreneurial markets um, that makes imperialism or colonialism necessary. And I think that was an old Leninist critique, both an explanation of why capitalism didn't fail, and also his own contribution to Marxist thinking.
But
I think that's entirely wrong. Finally, um, I I think that where Michel gets things right is in this idea of decentralization, experimentation, and cooperation and competition, and of course the fusion phrase co-opetition is where we're going to find, not by virtue of rationalistic planning or this dirigisme, excuse my French, of the old left, but through these experimental forces that have to start with some concept of private property, of mine and thine. Let me experiment over here, you experiment over there. If you want to take your piece of the world and contribute it to the commons and experiment with that, that should not preclude me from trying a different path. And in the process, I think we're going to start to see evolutionary systems in which you'll discover the aptness of the application of commons, particularly networks, digital commons, and you'll see the aptness of entrepreneurial markets based on private property and private ownership. And then you're going to see hybrid forms like we're seeing now with token sales and fractional ownership of and governance of different online systems. So this yes and in your second tier thinking of Wilbur is really, I think, what we should be after, but that shouldn't preclude other systems. And I would caution not to import so much of the neo-Marxist thinking that can lead you astray in this regard.
so if I can make one first remark is that I do believe that the cost of communication is a factor, right? So if the way I look at history is you have small groups, tribes, everybody can talk to each other. That's peer to peer, and it's non-problematic. Once you scale, you have a conflict with a bigger, confederation or whatever. Peer to peer becomes too expensive, and you need hierarchy to keep organized. Because if you're fragmented, you cannot win the war. So in this competition, the reason that societies and civilizations centralized, I think, was also a result of the coordination and transaction cost reality.
Yes,
And of course,
absolutely
that is
agree.
precisely what has changed. So there's in a
Yes.
fundamental way, bureaucracy becomes unnecessary because we now have, what I call holoptical mutual coordination networks, right? So you go to Wikipedia or Linux or in the crypto world, you can see what everybody else is doing. So the need for intermediaries has actually, to a very large degree, collapsed. But I still think, and actually, I would call that and thinking that there is a necessary thing, which is that there is a collective common good. And this is maybe where we disagree about. So I think there is a field in which we operate that cannot merely be managed by individual decisions of private players. There are agreements that need to be made and enforced at a collective level. Now, whether you want to call that a state or, but I was listening actually to the Prospera person in Istanbul, and he was saying, "Oh, we're gonna tax people." Well, that's interesting, huh? So yeah, So you create a corporation, and now you're going to tax people. That sounds awfully lot like what a state is doing. And the reason is
Usage
simple,
fees.
because there's a collective. There's a collective field that needs taken care of. And in the crypto world is creating public goods funding because they need this whole collective infrastructure. So I think that's an important point of difference. Whether you think that, as some libertarians think that you know private people themselves will lead to good outcomes, and there's a lot to say about it. But I would tell you, if you look at a map of forests, you will see that the green parts of the world are commons, not private. The private
Tosh.
forests are hyper exploited, um, and being deforested, and it's the commons managed forests that are actually staying green. So I think we shouldn't be too orthodox
I,
on either side. I think, but I also want to say another thing. It's important to make a difference between markets and capitalism, right? And think about, for example, land reform. There are studies very clear that countries that didn't have land reform didn't make it. Like the shift to modernity requires land reform. So, for example, Korea
and by
did a
by by
very
by that,
efficient
do you
land
mean
reform and became, very and this is about distribution of property, right? So it's about combating oligarchy, and that it doesn't. So I would submit to you that any competition for a scarce resource, which is totally unregulated, leads to oligarchy, because every iteration in the game, somebody is winning and becoming stronger than somebody else. And so, and and again, what is the crypto world doing? It is creating anti-oligarchic protocols like quadratic funding and quadratic voting. So, and that's a good thing for me. And yes, you don't need the state to do that. You have done it yourself because you're a community, right? But it's not the individuals by themselves. It's because there's actually a group of people making decisions that, in order for the ecosystem to thrive, they need certain rules. And I think historically that's what the state actually grew out of. And it has outgrown its welcome in the form that exists today. But I think if we think and we can say, okay, we want thriving markets, we want good common good institutions, and we want thriving distributed networks. And 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 what is the best way to combine them? I mean, that is open to discussion and to experimentation.
then we don't disagree at all, really. I mean, I don't think anyone anyone would argue that there aren't collective action problems. Now, if you were to argue, Michel, that we need a global level network of governance that would make a unitary decision on behalf of everyone in the world, even if that consensus mechanism were developed to be as, if you like, democratic, although I resist that majoritarian language, but as distributed as possible, still a unitary decision on behalf of all human beings, then I think that is deeply problematic. However, if we think in terms of larger sort of jurisdictions, holistic jurisdictions, that are many, so you get some measure of pluralism, and each of those, based on its particular circumstances of time and place, make decisions, unitary decisions to resolve collective action problems in competition, where these jurisdictions can learn from each other on best practices and dispatch things that fail. This is the anti-fragile argument of Nassim Taleb. Then I totally agree with you. And there can be communication networks, of course, between and among these jurisdictional bodies. However, the consensus mechanism is contrived. That I think we needn't disagree really at all. And I would just say, if your cosmolocal style production works really well, solves certain kinds of environmental problems, stewardship problems, conservation problems, then absolutely go for it. But criticize by creating, not by rationalistic theorizing. And I can sense, based on your history as a startup guy, and that you're not just an intellectual, that you're about trying things out, where a monolithic system could be catastrophic failure, even if the consensus mechanism is distributed.
Yeah, I think the issue is, at a global level. So, let's say, rare earth materials, right? And suddenly that becomes an issue. Like, you can't make chips. At this point, you have a real danger of a war between the US and China, right? So you have to take into account those kinds of issues as well. Like, there have been many, many wars about oil. There's an argument to be made that almost every last war was about, indirectly, but very clearly about, control of this resource, right? So this is, I think, a field where you have to say it's better to have an agreement, and that will likely result in some kind of institution that will, be in charge of maintaining that agreement, right? I'm fully aware that can go wrong. I mean, look at the WHO. In my view, that went very, very wrong in 2020. So obviously, big issues in
Or the
making
you,
them
yeah.
fair and democratic. But I don't think, again, this is the key thing. Like, what do you do with the common field in which we all operate? And that is a question that hasn't disappeared, even in an age of networks. But I do believe, the bottom up story, in my view, is like, so let's say you want, Airbnb is deeply problematic in terms of gentrification, chasing out the middle class from big cities. Um, and so let's say there's an alternative, Fairbnb, right? So Fairbnb, which exists, by the way, the thing is, if 20 or 30 cities wants to make their own Fairbnb, that's ridiculous. They should have an open source, uh, you know, commons where they can learn from each other how to do Fairbnb, right? So that would be like an organic way to create domain specific, I call them magisteria of the commons. And this is happening, by the way. There's the Open Food Network. There are many, many initiatives that go in that direction. Um, I'm not sure that this will solve these like really global, you know, existential issues that we are facing. So I don't know.
Well, let me. I mean, again, I want to appeal to the bourgeois economist in you, if there is one, in a lot of respects. There are processes that come about by virtue of private property, specifically assigned institutions and property, such as property rights, the price system, which I think is a terrible idea to dispatch entirely in favor of a commons management scheme. In other words, have a both and system, but don't get rid of prices.
I agree.
I think
I
it's
agree.
also it's super important to have a profit and loss system in some sense, where profit and loss, whatever the organism that you're describing, whatever the organization, needs to have revenue in excess of costs. If you don't have that, then you have gotten rid of the measurement system for whether or not you're creating value. So these kind of institutions you don't want to get rid of. These are market entrepreneurship institutions that give rise to, it's like, okay, we need to all have a big global kumbaya and agreement about how to use common pool resources. Well, first of all, just as you're right that there are pragmatic considerations about nations going to war, there are also pragmatic considerations about fashioning such an agreement, and people, and there's a deep problem of what you would call what's the term in game theory, defection. from these kind of agreements. So these kind of Kyoto agreements and things like that, there are strong incentives to defect. The nations of the world, we wish that we could all get together and save the planet from global climate change. But these global agreements tend to fail for game theoretical reasons, and good reasons, particularly because the circumstances of time and place in each country's specific kind of development give these particularly strong incentives because they're in different places on what is known as the environmental Kuznets curve. So that's a problem. But we don't want to dispatch with these fundamental institutions, the three Ps: prices, property, profit, and loss, because this is what gives rise to harnessing, to a very great degree, the brilliance of the human mind. We have more people trying to solve problems at the same time and in different ways because they have an incentive to do so. We get processes like substitution, where we no longer need whale oil. We use that smelly stuff that's in the ground called oil to fuel our cars and lubricate them, or we replace it with the latest generation of nuclear power reactors, so that we no longer have to extract the oil and contribute more CO2 into the atmosphere. So this process of substitution and ephemeralization happens through entrepreneurial markets to such a high degree that it's not clear how bureaucratic management or sort of open source,
I can give you an
stuff
example.
is going to.
Max, I want to give you an example. And I think this is what is actually evolving right now. So I see a three-layered system. So the first layer is mutual coordination. And we have already in open source, it's been working for 15, 20 years now. We have it in crypto. So the abilities to see what others are doing, and you can self-adjust your behavior to the needs of the ecosystem, which you can see, following your own criteria and your contributory freedom to participate or not. The second layer is what I would, call regenerative markets. So we now have the capability to do programmable currencies. So Fishcoin, for example, is the idea that you create as much coin as you can fish, without endangering the reproduction of the fish. So this is a market, but a market that is embedded in an ecological reality, right? So the second layer, that's for me the second layer. It's like an intelligent market, a more intelligent market than that we have today, with more signals, more rich layer than just one price. You can have like a much richer vision. And then the third layer, and this is where we come to agreements. So there is a study from a French engineer. So you can calculate like resources, right? How much copper there is in the world, how much the productivity of copper has evolved over a long time period, how much you lose when you recycle it, and it gives you a broad idea of like certain limitations that objectively exist about copper, and then there's certain negative pivots that when you go under them, it creates like a accelerated decline, right? So for me, that would be like a third layer, and so that it informs the two other layers. So you have context-based sustainability, but you're still deciding, within that frame, you're free, but you're not free. And I admit that is a thing. You're not free to destroy the 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 planet. And let me give you an example of perverse markets, which is going on right now. So it's with the credits around forests. So let's say you have a very, very rich forest somewhere in France. This is a real article I read. I forgot the name of the place, and um, it's been there for ages. It's used by by all the people in the community, and etc. And then somebody wants to buy that forest, and it's very attractive. So the city wants to sell it, And so what happens is apparently, so they have these credit things, right? So they say, oh, but we can substitute, right? So you're going to substitute a real living forest with a compensation somewhere else. And you know what it turns out to be? That they're so clever that they're claiming that they're new forests, but they're just buying forests that already exist. So in other words, they're destroying a real forest and they're using a market mechanism to claim that they've substituted and that claim. And so there's a lot of these markets that under the name of market, ideology are being invented in this kind of neoliberal way of thinking that I think are really counterproductive.
I mean,
I
But I think
at the
it's,
same time,
Michelle, if I may, because I've seen as a startup investor many of these solutions, also like carbon or climate credits or whatever, but they seem to me to come from the same place. They come from a place, all right, we have these big problems that we see in this dilemma, right? Because to effectively address them, you need to have some of the instrument that Max is describing, right? But then you also that's not guaranteed to work, right? Because you have all these trade-offs that get very complex, right? So how do you trade off a resource who doesn't have an owner or a value function, right? So how do you price discriminate for someone who's not there, who can't observe it, who can't hold you accountable, right? So this is, in a sense, I see many of these solutions and they come from a good place, but they just see how difficult it is, right? And I think if it's difficult already at that level, it's not necessarily easier at a bigger level. And you probably agree with that, right? This speaks to how much you need experimentation, and they need to come from a place where it's easy to experiment and has low cost of transactional communication and quick ways to get started. And that's why the proprietarian framework or crypto, the ability to generate digital scarcity that describes real value, can be so valuable, right? But it doesn't mean that these market mechanisms are automatically the right solutions to every problem, right?
yeah, and that's kind of the punchline I was headed toward, Nicholas, is that it's like if you want to pick, we can go back and forth all day about the failures of so-called market failures, and so-called government failures or bureaucratic failures. We can probably go all day on
commons
even
failures,
failures to manage the
of
commons
course.
locally. I mean, it's like all systems, no system is perfect. So we're constantly experimenting in local circumstances to try to, and we need a meta institutional substrate that maximizes that. Now, this is going to probably offend you deeply, but I would say so in the United States, we have a nonprofit organization called the Nature Conservancy. Okay. And there are things that the Nature Conservancy does that I don't like. Like a lot of times they acquire private property that they don't want to be developed because it's a crown jewel in a sense. It's an old growth forest or it's a beautiful area or what have you. It has so many of these beautiful ecological goods or environmental goods that they really, really want to protect. And their whole raison d'etre is to find and assimilate these into their private property system and then use there's a common law legal, or maybe statutory, in any case, a legal function to take it off the market in perpetuity so that it's
Right.
preserved. Now, that may be a function of the state. I don't know that last bit, but all the way up to this point, there was a sense of people valuing the same thing you value, which is always subjective, right? So if there's an old growth forest that the town manages, and through some democratic process or through some corrupt process or whatever, it comes to be acquired, the transition between public or common ownership, bureaucratically managed ownership, and private ownership has to be considered in the institutional substrate that we're talking about. But at the end of the day, there will always be times when some environmental good is acquired and used by people who value it differently to you. And that is fundamental to human nature. It doesn't mean that they are somehow benighted, because it all cuts both ways. There are always trade-offs in everything. And so a meta system of evolution, experimentation, and emergence can help us discover these trade-offs and minimize them to the extent that we balance human needs with the needs of the planet.
Michel, feel free to react. I'd like to bring the discussion or the final piece towards what you said, Michel, are exit strategies of crypto and what's good and bad about them. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
I'm not sure that I understand what you mean by exit strategies. Can
Okay. Yeah, so exit strategies for crypto are, so there's this book by Balaji Srinivasan called The Network State, right?
okay.
So existing state institutions fail us, they're constraining us. So let's like start a new country or start a new society or start a new coordination. So what's your read of the space and what you think is good or bad
Okay.
about them, or what you would like to
So
draw particular attention to?
so here's my fear, or so. Of course, it all depends how you see the current situation in the world. So I think we are um, in a certain danger of ecological, climate, resource issues. I think this is real, right? I think that there is real overshoot and real overuse by humanity. And so I think we need to shift from an immature technosphere that cannot live in balance with the biosphere to a mature technosphere that can live in balance with the biosphere. And that this is kind of the transition that we are going through at a macro level. And so if you look at history and you look at how civilizations go through crisis, so it's like the crisis, then you have an exodus, and then you have a rearrangement, right? Like a bifurcation towards a new form. So you have relatively stable system, chaotic transition, relatively stable. It's quite observable if you look at history. So exodus can be seen in a good and a bad way. In the good way of exodus is people are seeing that the old system doesn't work, or it's not working for them, or they're kicked out, right? And so in this cauldron, seed forms evolve, and then eventually subsystems evolve, and then eventually you have like a coherent new stable system. Um, so that's like a positive thing in terms of exodus. You have another kind of exodus, which I think is also very real, and this is the following: okay, the Earth is collapsing. Let's make sure we have money and we can move around, right? And I think a big part of the crypto community has that motivation. Um, okay, we're gonna have Bitcoin, so okay, we don't have to worry about hyperinflation, and I can be a crypto nomad. I can go there and there and there and there. And I think that's short-sighted. I think first of all, if the crisis advances, we're gonna have real issues about energy, food provisioning, and so if you're really realistic, you need to take into account. And then the second thing is the people. So if you have an explosion of impoverishment, you know historically it doesn't go well. Like, people will target those that are seen to be parasitic to them. um, so I, I think in general it's much healthier to think in terms of like, okay, how can we embed ourselves with local communities, not apart from them, and make positive agreements and find mutual benefits. So I think that's an important thing. And so I think some of the thinking around network states is motivated by the first. And of course, I would prefer the second. I can give you an interesting example. People I met in Istanbul. So, you know this famous article by Douglas Rushkoff. He was invited to speak for a dozen billionaires, and then they closed the door and said, Douglas, we all have our, we bought our islands, we have our bunkers, but how can we trust the people who are going to defend us, right? Because they need people with guns to keep the rebel out. And the answer is you can't, because you're just one billionaire, and these 15 people that you hire can say, oh well, maybe we should be the boss. So then I met the Moynihan brothers, who are kind of like, maybe they're not billionaires, but they did well, and they're creating eco villages in New Zealand, right? So they have real communities around them that they helped. And so this is a bit of the thing that I'm thinking of. And so in terms of the network state and network nations, I'd rather see network nations like the one I work for, so the Global Chinese Commons, who create real communities, have a desire to connect with the local population, see how they can help them, that invest massively in public goods. I just think this not just altruistic. It's also, I think, actually even selfishly more an interesting strategy. So that's kind of like a critique that I could have on. But otherwise, I think, of course, Balaji is brilliant, and I think these things are going to happen. I listened to a few of these network state presentations, and I said, "Wow, they're much further in this than I thought." So I'm pretty sure a number of these things are going to happen. But
Yeah.
I think if it's too much of like, let's secede and have our little paradise amongst our own, then I don't think in the end it will not be successful.
Yeah, I
You
100% agree with
always
that,
you
Michel.
need a
Yeah.
society that is friendly to the majority of the
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I
Or they come
100%
for
agree
you
with
with
that.
pitchfork.
And Max and Tails know they've been here 3-4 weeks ago in Roatan in Honduras, and that's what we're building. It's like a local community. It's very strongly embedded with locals, and mutually benefiting from each other. That's why I think it's personally the most important project in the field. You're more than welcome to visit, by the way. So I think that's really the model for the future, where where we build communities that have this very strong local grounding and
Yeah,
create a lot of positive
I can't
externalities.
hear you anymore, Nicholas.
Yeah, I
Maybe
cannot hear Nicolas either.
Okay.
maybe you'll permit
Uh,
me to have a closing thought on that.
sure.
Of course, I was just with you in Prospera and Roatan a month ago, and I fell in love with the place, the people, and the conceptual framework around it. I think it's a beautiful balance of pragmatism and idealism, and it's just at its genesis. So it is simultaneously a Genesis story and an Exodus story, if we want to get biblical, because it is a place to which people can exit in an otherwise what I see is an increasingly hostile, authoritarian world, one that is run, and I'm very happy to admit this, by corporations in collusion with states. I don't want to see a world, by the way, that is run entirely by uh, sort of corporations that look like governments, and that is something that I think probably Michel and I share a sort of a suspicion of the work of what's his name, Gray Mirror. Do you know
Curtis
what I'm talking
Yarvin.
about, Nicholas?
Curtis Yarvin,
Curtis
yes.
Yarvin, yeah. I'm very suspicious of that kind of thinking, and I think he should probably just follow Nick Land to China and go be happy there. But I'm not, and so I think that is a bizarre um, sort of retrogressive in the Ken Wilber sense, going back to it's a dead end that sort of goes back to blue and has flecks of orange in it, and I'm not too keen
Yeah,
on
I
that.
agree with you. I agree. And
And
So where we agree is that what we are living in now is a very negative phase.
Yeah,
Like you've seen it on Facebook, it's censored massively. You can have free thinking, and as an intellectual, and I'm very old fashioned 19th century almost intellectual type. Like I think free thinking is the basis of everything. If you can't think, you can't do. And so and right now, you can't think on the social media. You can't think. And so I'm for the creation of what is called invisible colleges, smaller groups of people who can have very qualitative conversations like we are having here.
absolutely.
And no, and we can disagree, but we will still respect each other, and we learn from each other. But and we are living in a world where this is disappearing, where the Western, what is so typical of the Western tradition, I think, is exactly the thing that is endangered. Um, and so I fully understand the impulse to create places where you can live protected from this. And I haven't visited you, and I have to say I have some of my old anti-libertarian kind of, but it's in any way, experimentation is always good. you know it's that's the thing. It's
Yeah,
you're
I'd really
you
love you
made an
to visit it.
agreement
I
with
think you'll
the
have a great
country.
time and it will
Yeah.
be a
Well,
great learning
I would,
experience for you and for
yeah,
us as well. So in January and February, we're going to do another Zusalut High pop-up city, by the way. So I'd love to invite you, Michel, and Max as well, of course. And we also have one sub-conference where I'd love to give you a talk, Crypto Cities and Network States again. So maybe that could be a good opportunity. We'll definitely be in touch about this. And also, to listeners who are listening to
Right.
this and want to continue some of these debates with us, please join us in Vitalia. We're very booked out in terms of applications, but for listeners of this podcast, I can, of course, make an exemption because if you've been listening so far to this, I know you're very engaged. So I can prefer you for that. Great, Michel. Max, do you want to say any final words of insights or learnings that you gained from this conversation that you're taking away or that you'd like listeners to take away?
Mm, no, not really. I just want to make a bit of advertising. So I have the wiki.p2pfoundation.net. We have 25,000 articles on how peer-to-peer is influencing, changing every domain, including spirituality, business, politics. Um, and I have a Substack called Forge Civilization Substack, where I just wrote an article which I'm really happy about, uh, somewhat provocatively titled "Will the Global Chinese come and save the Earth?" And I talk about neo-Venetian networks. And so the idea is that this is a new kind of economic network that is built around community. And I think very much that crypto is doing that. So it's not just business. It's not just making money. It's about creating community and trust. And it's a bit of a paradox because they always talk about trustless, but it actually, there's a lot of work done on the human side. And I think that's how it should be. And so what you are doing, guys, I think that's very positive, is you creating forms of markets and business that are not corporations, right? Because Curtis Yarvin, that's what he wants. He says every corporation is dictatorship, and that's why they work. And so he wants the whole country to be a dictatorship. It's a bit paradoxical. And I don't think that's what you guys are doing. And so in that sense, we share a lot of common ground, and we're also different, and that's how it should be. So
That's
thanks,
good.
Max. I learned a lot from you. Thanks, Niklas, and thanks, Tales.
yeah,
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to exchange my views with yours.
It was fantastic to have
yeah,
you on. Max?
yeah. I just, I would first, I'd like to, I really want to see Michel develop an MVP or prototype um, again. I know that you have been involved in these cooperatives and these local communities in the past. they are startups of a sort, and they can work, especially if you get the sub-Dunbar dynamics right and the internetworking layer right. I think that they can work. I would love to see more of them. Maybe you could call it digital kibbutzim. My Jewish fiance would appreciate that. But that I want to see more of these kind of local experiments where you can overcome problems of shirking and the monitoring costs of shirking that happen after you get to super Dunbar numbers. And internetworking technology can help with that, so that these communes or these cooperative arrangements or these cosmo-local arrangements, which are more hybridized versions, can thrive. I want to see that. I think they are an important solution to certain kinds of local problems. Whether and to what extent they're a solution to global problems, I cannot say. However, I not only have learned from you over the years about the potential for these experiments, but really want to see them realized, and you're a thought leader in that space. Finally, I will make my own little ad, my own little capitalist ad. I would love for people to read underthrow.org, which is my publication. I publish every weekday. Sometimes I'll publish great thinkers like Niklas Ansinger, your host, and others, but usually it's my own stuff. And hopefully in the process of growing outward, I can publish many, many, many more voices. And I really want to give strong consideration to publishing some of Michel's work, if he'll allow me to. So,
Of course.
thank you very much.
Fantastic. Michel, Max, it was epic to have you on. Both of you major thinkers that have influenced me a lot, and I expect will do more so in the future. Like, highly recommended both of your blogs, Underthrow and Fourth Generation Civilization. For anyone who's interested in this movement and density centralization and different approaches to it, you have to read Michel's work and Max's work. So thanks so much for both of you to come on and have this really fruitful learning debate among people that are friendly and curious about each other's thought, even though they differ sometimes a bit in their ideas. I personally love these kinds of conversations. So thank you so much for giving us the gift of your time and attention and your thoughts.
Thank you.